June 16, 1976. Thousands of students take to the streets of Soweto to protest against racist apartheid policies of the white South African government. The protests were organized by the South African Students' Movement Action Committee with support from the Black Conscious Movement. The plan was to peacefully march on the streets, leading to a massive rally at Orlando Stadium. However, while on their way, they were met by heavily armed police who fired live ammunition in the peaceful demonstrators to disperse the crowds. The protests turned violent, hundreds were beaten, arrested, and shot. Word of the violent crackdown in Soweto spread all over the country, igniting more protests in other towns and cities. This led to more beatings, arrests, and killings. After 2 days of protesting, over 500 people ended up dead, mostly school children. Images of the police firing and killing peacefully demonstrating students were aired all over the world, leading to international protests and formation of anti-apartheid movements all over the world. In the United States of America, anti-apartheid movements emerged on college and university campuses, demanding the US government to act against the racist minority white government, calling for sanctions, disinvestment, and divestment. Unlike his predecessor, when Ronald Reagan came to power in 1980, he changed the entire approach on how the United States responded to white minority regime in Southern Africa. Reagan's policy on apartheid affected the entire South Africa, gave apartheid life, and Africans would have to endure 8 years of his presidency to see the entire system fully brought to an end. In this episode, we look at Reagan's foreign policy and why he supported apartheid.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
And so, on the 20th of January 1981, Ronald Reagan, aged 69, was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States of America. At the time of his takeover, across the Atlantic in Africa, coups had become a commonplace. The CIA was all over the continent. Most governments had adopted socialist policies. The Angolan Civil War was underway, and countries like Eritrea and Namibia were not yet independent. However, the most prominent issue was the racist apartheid government in South Africa that had intensified its crackdown on anti-apartheid protests. Apartheid was a system of government introduced by the National Party of South Africa as early as 1948, determined to ensure white supremacy for all time. To achieve this, they subjected the black population to a vast array of government controls and segregated from whites wherever possible. Every facet of their life, residence, employment, education, public amenities, and politics was regulated to keep them in a strictly subordinate role. In the name of apartheid, they uprooted over 3 million people from their homes to satisfy government planners. They imprisoned millions more for breaking apartheid regulations. Their objective was clear, as the Prime Minister Hans Strijdom told Parliament in 1956. Either the white man dominates or the black man takes over. The only way the Europeans can maintain supremacy is by domination. And the only way they can maintain domination is by withholding the vote from non-Europeans. This rendered blacks aliens within their own country. The government further engaged in relentless efforts to silence any dissenting voice. Various attempts by blacks to speak up against oppression were met by brutal repression. The growing tension was translated into repeated high-profile episodes of confrontation between the blacks and the white police. The best known of these episodes were the Sharpeville massacres in 1969 and the Soweto uprising in 1976. Because of the extreme human rights abuses inherent in the apartheid system and the large-scale oppression of South African blacks and coloureds, the moral dilemma of South Africa attracted public and official activist attention internationally. In America, the anti-apartheid movement included blacks and whites demanded freedoms for South Africa, which led to the Carter government to make steps towards pressuring the regime through sanctions and aid cuts in order to negotiate a peaceful resolution. However, the Carter government was defeated in an election by Reagan, marking the beginning of a new administration. Being a staunch conservative, Reagan made a sharp turn against Carter's policies. Reagan was a president who never thought highly of Africans and their leaders. While running his campaign in 1965 as governor of California during a luncheon speech with the state attorney general on emerging African nations, he said, "When they have a man for lunch, they really have him for lunch." Then, while serving as governor of California, he called African leaders monkeys in his phone call to the then President Nixon, who rhetorically laughed. Reagan said, "To see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they are still uncomfortable wearing shoes." In his first term in office, the American public grew increasingly vocal in its opposition to the apartheid policy. Their calls for disinvestment and divestment in South Africa gained critical mass following on college campuses, pressuring the Reagan administration to act. They argued that such actions would pressure the South African government to embark on negotiations which would ultimately lead to the end of apartheid. In response to these measures, Reagan and his administration were strictly against disinvestment, sanctions, boycotts, arms embargoes, or anything that would cripple the South African economy, claiming it would hurt the very people they are trying to help. They cited an example of American industries that employed over 80,000 blacks, claiming that their employment practices were, quote, different from the normal South African customs. In fact, in May 1981, 4 months in office, Reagan hosted the South African Minister for Foreign Affairs, Pik Botha, something the South African government could only dream of under the Carter administration. On his return to South Africa, Botha said they had a very good ally in Washington. Reagan's opposition to disinvestment received support within the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, coming from both black and white leaders. Among them was Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the chief minister of KwaZulu-Natal and the president of the Inkatha Freedom Party, who slammed these sanctions. So, what was the alternative? Well, there were two. One was the Sullivan Principles, drafted by Reverend Leon Sullivan in 1977, who was the first African-American appointed to the board of directors at General Motors. His principles called for a set of standards for American-based companies that did business in South Africa. They included fair employment, fair pay, and non-segregation of employees in work facilities. The other was a policy known as constructive engagement, which was the official alternative by the Reagan administration. Designed by Chester Crocker, the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, the policy was built on the assumption that reform could only come if the South African government was given incentives through trade and relations. By this approach, they thought the US government would influence the minority white South African government to move away from apartheid. They also believed that change in South Africa should occur progressively, without revolutionary means, and that the United States should work with the South African apartheid government and not against it to achieve this purpose. Although not linked together, constructive engagement and the Sullivan Principles sought to destroy apartheid in South Africa, while maintaining a diplomatic status quo between Pretoria and Washington. However, both policies failed to address the violence apartheid had caused in South Africa. To put it simply, one can say Reagan negotiated to end apartheid by simply empowering and supporting it. However, the backers of constructive engagement to this day insist that the plan wasn't racist or pro-apartheid, but it was intended to counter communist expansion in Southern Africa with the help of the government in Pretoria. Let me explain. To understand this argument, we need to know the players, who included the US, South Africa, Angola, Cuba, and Namibia. By 1981, Angola was ruled by a pro-communist regime under the MPLA, with over 30,000 Cuban troops present in the country. At the time, there was a civil war between the rebel group UNITA under Jonas Savimbi and the MPLA under José Eduardo dos Santos. The Cuban troops had come on request of the MPLA government against the South Africans who had earlier invaded Angola, fearing the spread of communism and the spillover of the civil war in neighboring Namibia, which was under the South African occupation. They also claimed the government in Angola, being pro-communist, it had harbored anti-apartheid guerrillas like the ANC, who used it as a base to attack the government in Pretoria. South Africa had occupied Namibia and suppressed independence movements, using the presence of Cuban troops in Angola as an excuse to continue its illegal occupation. The South African occupation of Namibia started after the First World War in May 1915, when General Louis Botha, the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, ordered 40,000 South African troops into the territory, kicked out the Germans, and took over. Their occupation was sealed when the League of Nations authorized their mandate over the territory. Although the mandate was abolished by the UN in 1966, South African rule continued despite being illegal under international law. So, the United States under Reagan, with no clear motives except prestige, intervened to ensure the withdrawal of the Cuban troops and have a settlement on the independence of Namibia. In the end, troop withdrawal would reduce tensions between the East and West in Southern Africa, while a Namibian settlement would end one of the last vestiges of colonialism and a threat to stability in the region. To avoid another Vietnam, Reagan refrained from deploying American troops on ground. Instead, he settled on supporting UNITA rebels with the help of the South Africans to fight his proxy war. So, Savimbi was bankrolled with over $200 million to fight the communist MPLA government. For their intervention in Angola, the Reagan administration recognized the apartheid regime and looked the other way on racial issues. Also, South Africa was to grant independence to Namibia. By providing armed support to Jonas Savimbi, the United States simply increased Angola's dependence on the Cubans, escalating the entire conflict. Rather than allow UNITA to overthrow the Angolan government, Cuba dispatched more troops to Angola in order to shore up the Rwanda regime. But surely, for Namibia to get independence, not aiding UNITA was the more promising path to secure the withdrawal of Cubans. However, Reagan disagreed, causing a catastrophic disaster in Southern Africa that created one of Africa's longest civil war, left millions dead and displaced, delayed the independence of Namibia, and entrenched the apartheid regime. Bearing no fruit, the policy of constructive engagement stalled and did not make any progress, except it only strengthened the government in Pretoria. As a result, public criticism and renewed calls for the imposition of stringent sanctions intensified. It appeared that for Crocker and Reagan, the existence of racial discrimination did not necessarily call for an instant dismantling of apartheid. What was obvious was that other strategic and geopolitical concerns were given priority on how the Reagan administration would deal with South Africa. In one of his speeches, Reagan even defended the Botha administration in South Africa by saying, quote, "They have eliminated the segregation that we once had in our own country." Furthermore, in a telegram to all African diplomatic posts, the president made it clear that the broad objective of the United States in Southern Africa, quote, "is to strengthen this region for growing importance to American interests." By so doing, Reagan appeared unconcerned with the plight of thousands of black South Africans suffering under a rigid system of racial segregation. His views were widely shared by members of his administration. His representative to the United Nations even stated that, quote, "racism is not as bad as Marxism." His Secretary of State also used a protective tone on apartheid in another telegram to diplomatic posts. We will recognize and deal objectively with the South African government's legitimate security concerns. The Secretary of State went further to claim that Americans have certain national security interests that, quote, could not be jeopardized for the sake of moralistic pronouncements. In 1984, Ronald Reagan addressed the UN and supported a peaceful resolution away from apartheid, but was still complicit and unwilling to pressure South Africa to change. That same year, South African Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to eliminate apartheid. He later met Reagan that same year, who preached his constructive engagement rhetoric. However, speaking on Capitol Hill at a House hearing, Tutu delivered a speech declaring, quote, "Constructive engagement is an abomination and unmitigated disaster. In my view, the Reagan administration's support and collaboration with apartheid is equally immoral, evil, and totally unchristian. You are either for or against apartheid, and not by rhetoric. You are either in favor of evil or you are in favor of good. You are either on the side of the oppressed or on the side of the oppressor. You cannot be neutral," he said. After Reagan met with Tutu, he was asked at a press conference to talk about their meeting. Reagan replied, "It is counterproductive for one country to splash itself all over the headlines, demanding that another government do something." Then he claimed that black tribal leaders had expressed their support for the American investment in a bid to discredit Tutu's argument that US policy had hurt the blacks. Desmond Tutu's speech was a turning point for the Reagan administration and also the beginning of the end of constructive engagement. By 1985, Reverend Leon Sullivan decided to expand the scope of the Sullivan Principles to companies compliant, to include public support and call for an end to all apartheid laws, to push for non-Sullivan companies to follow the standards of equal rights, and to encourage freedom of mobility for black South African workers through building adequate housing near the workplace. The expansion of the Sullivan Principles coincided with the obvious failures of constructive engagement and the growing political rhetoric that conflated the two. With no success to show, Chester Croker claimed the Sullivan Principles as part of success of constructive engagement. However, he suffered a heavy blow from Leon Sullivan, who distanced himself from Reagan's administration in retaliation. Even after he expanded the scope of his program, anti-apartheid activists criticized the Sullivan Principles for helping to prop up the white minority government in South Africa. By 1987, Sullivan gave up completely on his own program. In June, he called for the complete withdrawal of all American companies operating in South Africa and a total US embargo against South Africa until apartheid ended. After Reagan's first term in office, it was clear that constructive engagement, as it was implemented, failed to engender any change within the government in Pretoria. In fact, by 1985, the white minority government advocated for even stronger apartheid measures, believing they were safe from any major international sanctions since they were under the protection of the United States. Further, the South African government totally resented the policy. Top officials of the apartheid government believed that constructive engagement was an excuse for the United States to meddle in South African domestic policies. On the 15th of August 1985, South African President P.W. Botha gave a speech where he was expected to announce major reforms, including the release of Mandela. However, Botha addressed none of it in the face of increasing unrest in South Africa. This came to be known as the Rubicon speech. He said that South Africa would never accept one man, one vote in a unitary system. Real democracy, he said, would lead to chaos. He ended his speech by saying, "I believe that we are today crossing the Rubicon. There can be no turning back." Pressure built both in and out of South Africa. Protests in South Africa led to the imposition of martial law. At the same time, black majority opposition faced growing instances of violence that the US news outlets broadcasted nightly. African Americans, university students, and other civil rights activists in America began lobbying Congress to take action against the apartheid regime if Reagan would not. As pressure mounted, Crocker was forced to face questioning in the Senate and defend his policy amidst claims of its failure. In his statement to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in September 1984, Crocker declared that constructive engagement was working, regardless of the rising violence in South Africa. To back up his claims, he observed, the increase in black rioting and police violence was a phenomenon that tends to occur precisely when rigid old patterns are beginning to break up. At this point, America had had enough, so in April 1985, Democrats in the Senate initially tried to pass the Anti-Apartheid Act, but could not overcome a Republican filibuster. Scared, President Reagan viewed the act as an intrusion on his authority to conduct foreign policy and warned in the event the act passed, he would veto it. To cope with the pressure, he issued his own set of sanctions, which Democrats considered to be watered down and ineffective. During his speech in 1986, Reagan condemned Mandela's group, the ANC, which was leading the black struggle against apartheid, saying it engaged in calculated terror that involved the mining of roads, bombing of public places, designed to bring about further repression. When the apartheid regime in South Africa declared the ANC as a terrorist organization, the Reagan administration followed suit. At the time, the ANC was strongly supported by the Soviet Union to fight apartheid and bring about voting rights for South African blacks and coloreds. A leap of hope came about in 1986 when the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Bill was reintroduced. The bill was aimed at imposing sanctions against South Africa and stated 5 preconditions for lifting the sanctions that would essentially end the entire system. Receiving bipartisan support from both the Democrats and the Republicans, the bill passed by a veto-proof margin of 84-14. As previously warned, on the 26th of September, Reagan vetoed the bill, claiming it would fuel violence and invite Marxist tyranny. In response to the veto, Archbishop Desmond Tutu condemned Reagan and said, "The man who applied sanctions at the drop of a hat against Poland, Nicaragua, and Libya refuses to steadfastly take any effective action against one of the most vicious policies in the world. Apartheid will be dismantled, and its victims will remember who helped to destroy this evil system. And President Reagan will be judged harshly by history." In the week leading up to the subsequent vote to override his veto, it had become clear that his fellow Republicans were going to turn against him. So, Reagan enlisted South African Foreign Minister Pik Botha to call Republicans on the fence to oppose overriding his veto. Republican Senator Richard Lagar led the charge to override the veto, turning against a president that he typically supported. Lagar declared on the Senate floor, "We are against tyranny, and tyranny is in South Africa." On the 2nd of October, Reagan's veto was eventually overridden by Congress, with the Senate voting 78-21 and the House by 313-83. The override marked the first time in the 20th century a president had a foreign policy veto overridden. Apartheid opponents in the United States and South Africa applauded the vote, while the critics argued that it would either be ineffectual or lead to more violence. The override was seen as a major defeat for Reagan, coming at the hands of fellow Republicans in Congress. What hurt Reagan the most was the fact that he was to meet Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland, the leader of the Soviet Union, prior to the veto. Reagan attempted to salvage his veto, making phone calls, pleading with a number of senators, arguing he wouldn't want to appear weak and ineffective in Iceland if he were rebuffed by the Republican-controlled Senate on a major foreign policy question. He tried to bolster his cause by promising to impose some economic sanctions on his own and by appointing the first black ambassador to South Africa. However, these efforts only gained him 7 more votes than the total that opposed the bill in August. All the 21 votes to sustain the veto were cast by Republicans, but the key to the outcome was the 31 Republicans, including many conservative allies of Mr. Reagan, who were not persuaded by his arguments. A good example was Mitch McConnell, a first-time Republican from Kentucky, who said he was casting his vote against the president on a foreign policy issue with great reluctance. But on this question, the lawmaker said, "I think he is ill-advised. I think he is wrong. We have waited long enough for him to come on board." The legislation banned all U.S. trade and investment in South Africa, refused South African Airways flights landing permission at U.S. airports, and prohibited loans to the South African government. The legislation was also seen as a catalyst for similar sanctions in Europe and Japan and signaled the end of the constructive engagement policy. Defeated, Reagan reiterated that his administration and all America opposed apartheid and said the debate was not whether to oppose apartheid, but instead how best to oppose it and how to bring freedom to the troubled country. In 1989, the General Accounting Office said in a report that sanctions against South Africa had only been partially enforced by the Reagan administration. That same year, the newly elected president, George Bush, enacted full enforcement of the Anti-Apartheid Act, a departure from the Reagan administration's policy. Between 1990 and 1991, South African President F.W. de Klerk made steps towards meeting the preconditions of the Anti-Apartheid Act. Following de Klerk's repeal of apartheid laws and the release of Nelson Mandela, President Bush issued an executive order lifting virtually all bans against doing business with South Africa. The collapse of apartheid marked the end of the white minority rule and the beginning of the black majority rule under Nelson Mandela in 1994. In 1990, Namibia achieved her independence. A year later, Cuban troops completely withdrew from Angola, and the Soviets pulled out all its support. Later, the MPLA government denounced Marxism and embraced free market policies, and so the US recognized the MPLA government. The degree to which sanctions ended apartheid was a matter of debate, as those opposed to sanctions argued that the South African economy was already struggling before the sanctions were enforced, and that it was the political process on ground that led to these changes. Despite the repeal, most of the sanctions imposed by this act, many companies were still restricted by laws within individual states and cities in the US to do business in South Africa. So, in September 1993, Nelson Mandela called for these sanctions to be removed and for investment to return to a still struggling South Africa. The last sanctions stemming from this act were repealed in November 1993. After surviving more than a dozen assassination attempts and having been reported dead at least 15 times, Jonas Savimbi was killed on the 22nd of February 2002 in a battle with Angolan government troops along the river banks in the province of Moshiko, his birthplace. Reagan's policy towards South Africa was clearly pro-apartheid. In the words of Desmond Tutu, quote, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." For Reagan, he didn't even have to be neutral at a time of great moral conflict. US foreign policies towards Africa are a subject less studied in contemporary African history and politics. While such policies and interventions majorly benefit the US and its Western allies, the continent is left plundered and stripped of anything of value, leaving absolute poverty and suffering. Interventions should be consistently aimed at making Africa a better, safer, and more democratic place, even if it coincides with the American interests. Short of this has led to more and more conflicts on the continent, making Africa a battleground for superpower rivalry and interests. In the name of the Cold War, a new war on the continent has emerged, called the War on Terror. The new war has plagued the continent, breeding more conflicts, plundering, and making Africa less democratic and free. In the name of terrorism, states have failed and collapsed because of interventions. Countries have fallen under absolute dictatorships that are against everything the US stands for. But that is not to deny terrorism, but when people who claim to fight terrorism create more terror than terrorism itself, then it challenges our minds on the purpose of anti-terror wars, which are the exact blueprint of anti-communist interventions. Unlike the Cold War, with the War on Terror,